White police officer Pepper sprays elderly black woman, and what happens next shocks everyone. On a quiet afternoon in a bustling city, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, an elegant 65-year-old black woman, was simply waiting for her bus at a stop. Dressed in simple but well-kept clothes, she held her groceries when a police car abruptly stopped beside her. Before we continue this shocking story, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. This story will make you think hard about prejudice in our society. Officer Richard Parker, known for his aggressive and prejudiced stance, got out of the car without even asking for identification. He approached Mrs. Thompson with pepper spray in hand, claiming she looked suspicious. What he didn't know was that this lady was the wife of the newly appointed Chief Samuel Thompson, the new commander of the city's police department. Without giving her a chance to defend herself, Richard sprayed directly into Mrs. Thompson's face, who fell to the ground, choking and begging for help. People around started filming, while others screamed in horror at the scene. A young lawyer passing by started recording and questioning the officer's action. That's when Mrs. Thompson's phone rang, and the chief's photo appeared on the screen. The arrogant smile on Richard's face began to fade when he saw that image. What would happen to Richard after this act of pure prejudice? How would Chief Thompson react upon discovering that his wife was humiliated by one of his subordinates? And more importantly, how long will our society tolerate actions like this? The consequences of this day would forever change not only Richard's life, but the entire department. What no one expected was that Mrs. Thompson, even after all the humiliation she suffered, would play a fundamental role in a transformation much greater than simple revenge. Is there forgiveness for acts of prejudice? Or do some actions deserve consequences too severe to be forgiven? Emily, the young lawyer who recorded the incident, approached Mrs. Thompson. "Ma'am, we need to report this immediately. This is a clear case of police brutality and racial profiling." Mrs. Thompson, still struggling to breathe, looked at Emily with tears in her eyes. "My dear, this is much bigger than just me. We need to use this to create real change." Meanwhile, Officer Parker's partner, rookie cop David Wilson, stood frozen, torn between his duty to support his fellow officer and the clear injustice he had just witnessed. As a crowd gathered, murmurs of anger and shock rippled through the onlookers. Smartphones captured every moment, and within minutes, the incident was spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Chief Thompson, in the middle of a meeting about community policing reforms, felt his phone vibrate repeatedly. Little did he know that his personal and professional lives were about to collide in a way he never imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the police department and force a city to confront its deep-seated issues of racial bias and police accountability. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson was no ordinary woman. A retired professor of sociology with a PhD from an Ivy League university, she had dedicated her academic life to studying race relations. Her love story with Chief Samuel Thompson began 35 years ago when he was a young lieutenant and she a budding university lecturer. Against all odds and prejudices of the time, they built a life together. Chief Thompson, a black man who had risen through the ranks through sheer effort and competence, had just taken command of the city's police department with the mission to modernize the force and combat institutional racism. His appointment didn't please everyone, especially the more conservative group of officers, of which Richard Parker was a fervent defender. Parker came from a traditional family of law enforcement officers. His father, a retired detective, raised his son with outdated and prejudiced values. Despite multiple complaints of abuse of authority, he always managed to escape serious punishment thanks to family connections within the department. Young Officer David Wilson, Parker's reluctant partner that day, was a 23-year-old rookie, the son of a domestic worker. He had joined the police force dreaming of making a difference, but increasingly found himself trapped in a system that seemed to perpetuate the same injustices he wanted to combat. Emily Brooks, the lawyer who filmed the incident, worked for a human rights NGO. The daughter of a pioneering black female judge, she grew up hearing stories of resistance and the struggle for equality. Her work focused precisely on cases of police violence against minorities. The neighborhood where the incident took place was known for its social contrast. On one side, executives in expensive suits entering and exiting mirrored buildings. On the other, workers returning home after long shifts. It was in this scenario of inequality that Parker usually made his selective approaches. That afternoon, while Mrs. Thompson was still recovering from the attack, Chief Thompson was in an important meeting with the General Command, discussing new guidelines for police approaches. His phone, silenced during the meeting, was accumulating dozens of messages and missed calls. News of the incident was spreading rapidly through social networks. The video recorded by Emily was already going viral in police and activist WhatsApp groups. Tension was growing by the minute, and the fate of several characters in this story was about to change drastically. At the hospital where Mrs. Thompson was taken, doctors noticed that in addition to the effects of pepper spray, she showed symptoms of severe anxiety. Years dedicated to studying racism had not prepared her to be a victim of such explicit violence. Parker, still at the scene of the incident, was beginning to feel the weight of his actions. For the first time in his career, his surname and family connections might not be enough to save him from the consequences. Fear was beginning to replace his usual arrogance. Wilson, the young officer, found himself facing a crucial choice: maintain the department's code of silence or do what he believed was right. His hands trembled as he typed a detailed report of the incident into the police system. Emily, in turn, was already coordinating with her contacts in the media and judiciary. This case could be the catalyst for changes she had long been fighting to implement. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Sarah Parker, Richard's wife, watched the viral video in horror, recognizing her husband as the aggressor. She began to question everything about their life together, remembering all the times she had ignored the signs of his prejudice. In a downtown office, journalist Michael Reed received an anonymous tip about the incident. As he began to dig deeper, he uncovered a pattern of similar incidents that had been systematically buried by the department. And in a community center, not far from where the incident occurred, local activist James Carter saw the video and immediately began organizing a protest. "This isn't just about one bad cop," he told his fellow organizers. "This is about a system that needs to change." As night fell on the city, the ripple effects of that afternoon's events were just beginning to be felt. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone involved to examine their beliefs, their actions, and their place in a society grappling with deep-rooted issues of race and justice. Chief Samuel Thompson was wrapping up his presentation on police reforms when his assistant burst into the meeting room, visibly pale. Within seconds, the chief's expression transformed as he watched the video of his wife lying on the ground. His first impulse was to rush out, but years of military training made him maintain his composure, externally at least. "Gentlemen, we have a critical situation," he announced, his controlled voice masking a growing fury. The video of the incident was projected for all the present command to see. The silence in the room was deafening. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Mrs. Thompson received a visit from Emily Brooks, who, besides recording the incident, decided to follow up on the case personally. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to discuss the legal measures we can take," Emily began, but was interrupted by Eleanor. "I don't just want punishment, dear, I want transformation," she responded, her eyes still red from the spray. "I've spent my life studying these power structures. Now I have the opportunity to change them from within." Parker, now aware of the magnitude of his error, was desperately trying to activate his connections. He called his father, the retired detective, who for the first time didn't have a ready solution. "Son, you attacked the chief's wife. Even I can't protect you this time." The case leaked to the press within hours. The headlines were merciless. Officer attacks superior's wife in racist act. Police assaults sociology professor in brutal approach. Racism in the police. How long will it continue? Wilson, the rookie officer, was called to internal affairs. His testimony would be crucial. On the way, he received several messages from other officers, some threatening him if he spoke the truth, others encouraging him to do the right thing. Chief Thompson finally arrived at the hospital. Seeing his wife, something inside him broke. He was no longer just the police chief. He was a black man seeing his life partner victimized by the very system he was trying to reform. "Samuel," said Eleanor, holding her husband's hand, "this is bigger than us. I don't want personal revenge. I want to use this for real change." Meanwhile, human rights groups were organizing protests in front of police headquarters. The hashtag Chugga Justice for Eleanor was already trending. The case was becoming a symbol of the fight against institutional racism. Parker was called to testify. On his way to internal affairs, he started receiving messages from other officers with a history of similar violence. They offered support, money for lawyers, even a plan to disappear for a while. For the first time, he found himself disgusted by these offers. Emily organized a press conference with other human rights lawyers. "We don't just want the punishment of an individual. We want systemic changes," she declared, echoing Eleanor's words. Young Wilson, after hours of reflection, made his decision. In his testimony to Internal Affairs, he not only confirmed Parker's brutality, but also presented a detailed history of other abuse cases he had witnessed in his short time on the force. Tension within the police department reached critical levels. On one side, more conservative officers defended Parker, claiming he was just doing his job. On the other, a new generation of officers, inspired by Chief Thompson's leadership, demanded profound changes. Eleanor, even while still recovering, began receiving invitations to give lectures about her experience. Her story was catalyzing a national debate on racism and police violence. Chief Thompson found himself in a unique position. As the husband of a victim and the commander of the aggressor, his actions would define not just Parker's future, but potentially that of the entire institution. Sarah Parker, Richard's wife, decided she could no longer stay silent. She reached out to Emily Brooks, offering to testify about her husband's history of racist behavior at home. James Carter, the local activist, organized a town hall meeting to discuss police-community relations. To everyone's surprise, several officers, led by Wilson, showed up to participate in the dialogue. Journalist Michael Reed published a series of articles exposing a pattern of covered-up incidents similar to Mrs. Thompson's case. His reporting put additional pressure on the department to enact real reforms. As the days passed, the case became a flashpoint for broader discussions about systemic racism, police accountability, and the need for comprehensive reform. The city found itself at a crossroads, with the actions of Chief Thompson, Mrs. Thompson, Parker, Wilson, and others set to determine the path forward. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only decide the fate of individuals, but potentially reshape the entire system of law enforcement in the city and beyond. As the main case unfolded, other stories began to emerge, adding layers of complexity to the situation. Wilson's mother, Margaret, a housekeeper who raised her son alone, sought out Mrs. Thompson at the hospital. As a working-class black woman, she shared her own story of facing racism and the constant fear she felt for her son in uniform. "My David joined the force wanting to make a difference," Margaret said, "but each day I see the fear in his eyes of either becoming like the others or being persecuted for being different." Meanwhile, Sarah Parker, Richard's wife, began questioning her entire life with her husband. She remembered the times he came home boasting about keeping order on the streets, and how she had always ignored the signs of his prejudice. Emily discovered that Mrs. Thompson's case wasn't isolated. 5 other people of color had filed complaints against Parker in recent months, but all were mysteriously archived. She began investigating a possible protection network within internal affairs. At police headquarters, Chief Thompson faced veiled resistance. Senior officers lost important documents for the investigation, meetings were cancelled at the last minute, and rumors about his partiality in the case began to circulate. Investigative journalist Michael Reed started receiving anonymous information about other cases of police violence involving Parker. The whistleblowers came from within the department itself, showing that not everyone was complicit in the system. Wilson, now seen as a traitor by some colleagues, found unexpected support from a group of young officers who secretly also wanted changes in the institution. They began meeting after hours to discuss reforms. Parker's father, retired Detective William Parker, began showing signs of remorse for having raised his son with racist values. During a visit to his son, he admitted for the first time, "Maybe I taught you all wrong, Richard." Mrs. Thompson, using her academic experience, began structuring, even from the hospital, a racial re-education program for the police. Her idea was to transform her traumatic experience into a tool for institutional change. The case also exposed divisions within the police community itself. Black officers, who had suffered in silence for years, began to speak out, sharing their own experiences of racism within the force. Emily discovered that Parker's previous partner had requested a transfer after reporting his violent conduct, but was labeled as problematic and relegated to administrative duties. She began to work on his reintegration into active service. The story reached the ears of a state legislator who began preparing a bill to make anti-racist training mandatory in police forces, using Mrs. Thompson's case as an example of the urgent need for change. Meanwhile, on social media, the debate intensified. There were both manifestations of support for the Thompson family and attempts to justify Parker's action, exposing how divided society still was on racial issues. James Carter, the local activist, organized a series of community dialogues, bringing together residents and police officers for frank discussions about race and policing. Sarah Parker, grappling with her role in enabling her husband's behavior, reached out to a support group for family members of police officers involved in misconduct. Chief Thompson, feeling the pressure from all sides, confided in his longtime friend and fellow officer, Captain Lisa Rodriguez. "I'm walking a tightrope here, Lisa. One wrong move, and I could lose everything we've worked for." Wilson, inspired by Mrs. Thompson's strength, began developing a community outreach program for rookie officers, aiming to bridge the gap between the police and the communities they serve. Michael Reed's investigation led him to uncover an unofficial group within the police force that called themselves the Old Guard, dedicated to maintaining the status quo and resisting progressive changes. As these subplots developed, it became clear that Mrs. Thompson's case was not just about one incident or one officer, but about a complex web of relationships, power structures, and deeply ingrained societal issues that would require more than just quick fixes to address. The city stood on the brink of a potential transformation, with the actions of each individual playing a crucial role in shaping the outcome. The case reached its critical point when, a week after the incident, an extraordinary meeting was convened at police headquarters. Chief Thompson, Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, recently discharged from the hospital, Richard Parker, David Wilson, and representatives from various spheres of public safety and civil society were present. The tension was palpable. Parker, visibly worn down, sat in a corner, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. Wilson, beside him, remained upright, determined. Mrs. Thompson, with unshakable dignity, occupied the center of the room next to her husband. Chief Thompson began the meeting with a statement no one expected. "We're here not just to judge an isolated act, but to recognize a systemic problem. As commander, I take my share of responsibility for not doing enough to prevent situations like this." A murmur ran through the room. It was unprecedented for a high-ranking officer to assume responsibility in this way. Mrs. Thompson then stood up, her presence silencing everyone. "I didn't come here seeking revenge. I came to propose a solution. The racism I suffered isn't just one officer's problem. It's a reflection of a society and institutions that need to change." She then presented her proposal: a comprehensive racial re-education and awareness program for the entire police force, starting with the highest-ranking officers. "And I want Officer Parker to be the first to go through this program," she concluded, to everyone's shock. Parker, who expected to be summarily dismissed, looked incredulously at Mrs. Thompson. It was then that Wilson asked to speak. "With all due respect, Mrs. Thompson, I think it's not enough. We need structural changes, not just training." To everyone's surprise, he presented a detailed dossier of police abuse cases and institutional racism that he had secretly collected over the months. "We can no longer pretend these are isolated cases," Wilson declared, his voice trembling but firm. The silence that followed was broken by a shout from the corridor. It was Sarah Parker, Richard's wife, who had arrived unexpectedly. "I want to speak," she demanded, entering the room. Sarah then made a shocking revelation. She had found a group chat on Richard's phone where several officers shared discriminatory approach tactics and discussed how to cover up cases of violence. "I always turned a blind eye, but I can't anymore. This has to stop," she said, tears in her eyes. The room erupted into chaos. Some officers tried to interrupt the meeting, others demanded immediate investigations. That's when Chief Thompson slammed his hand on the table, restoring order. "Today is a turning point," he declared. "From now on, no case will be covered up, no complaint ignored. We'll rebuild this institution from the ground up if necessary." He then turned to Parker. "You have two options. Accept the re-education program proposed by Mrs. Thompson and cooperate with the investigations, or face the legal consequences of your actions." Parker, for the first time, seemed truly affected. He looked at Mrs. Thompson, at his wife, at Wilson, and finally at Chief Thompson. I accept the program," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "and I'll cooperate with everything I know." At this moment, Michael Reed, who had managed to sneak into the meeting, was live-streaming everything on his news platform. Within minutes, the hashtag #PoliceReformNow became viral. The meeting ended with the announcement of a task force to implement immediate changes in the department, led by Mrs. Thompson, Wilson, and other progressive members of the police force and civil society. As they left the room, Mrs. Thompson approached Parker. "True strength isn't in oppressing, but in recognizing mistakes and changing. Your journey of redemption begins now." Emily Brooks, who had been observing the proceedings, stepped forward. "This is unprecedented," she said, "but it's just the beginning. We need to ensure these changes are implemented and sustained." Chief Thompson nodded in agreement. "We're rewriting the book on policing," he said. "It won't be easy, but it's necessary." As the news of the meeting spread, reactions varied widely. Some praised the bold steps towards reform, while others criticized what they saw as weakness in the face of political correctness. James Carter, watching the live stream with his activist group, felt a mix of hope and skepticism. "This could be a real change," he said, "but we need to keep the pressure on." As night fell, the city buzzed with discussions about the day's events. It was clear to everyone that this moment marked not just a turning point in the case, but the beginning of a profound transformation in policing and race relations in the city. The real work was just beginning. But for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope in the air. In the weeks following the historic meeting, consequences unfolded rapidly, affecting everyone involved and sending waves of change throughout society. Parker began the racial re-education program under intense public scrutiny. His first weeks were marked by resistance and denial, but gradually he began to understand the impact of his actions. In a particularly intense session, Parker finally broke down. I had never really stopped to think about the harm I was causing. I feel ashamed, he confessed, tears in his eyes. Mrs. Thompson, leading the program, saw this moment as a crucial opportunity. Shame is the first step, Richard. Now we need to transform it into positive action. Meanwhile, Chief Thompson faced an internal battle in the department. More conservative officers tried to sabotage his reforms, even proposing a vote of no confidence. However, surprisingly, a growing group of officers, inspired by Wilson's courage, began to speak out in support of the changes. Wilson, now seen as a hero by many and a traitor by others, faced daily threats. His mother, worried, even begged him to leave the force. But Wilson was determined. "Mum, this is exactly why I need to stay, so that other sons don't have mothers living with this fear." Emily Brooks continued her investigation, exposing a network of corruption and abuse of power that went far beyond Parker. Her reports led to the dismissal of several high-ranking officers and the restructuring of entire departments. In civil society, the case catalyzed a broader movement. Peaceful demonstrations occurred across the city, demanding reforms not just in the police, but in all institutions. The hashtag #TryTransformationNow became a rallying cry on social media. Sarah Parker faced her own journey of self-discovery. She joined a support group for family members of police officers, where she found others struggling to reconcile love and ethics. "It's not easy to admit that the person you love has done terrible things," she shared in the group. "But it's necessary for us to grow together." The racial re-education program began to expand beyond the police. Companies, schools, and other public institutions started adopting adapted versions of the curriculum developed by Mrs. Thompson. However, not everything was smooth sailing. Conservative groups organized counter-protests, claiming that the reforms were weakening the police. On social media, disinformation campaigns tried to discredit the movement. Chief Thompson, in a public statement, addressed these concerns. "A police force that respects all citizens is not a weak police force. It's a strong, reliable, and effective one. That's what we're building." Meanwhile, Parker, still in the re-education program, began to show real signs of change. He asked to speak with Mrs. Thompson privately. "I want to do more," he said, "not just go through the program, but help implement it for others." Mrs. Thompson looked him in the eyes, assessing his sincerity. "Richard, the road to redemption is long, but if you're truly committed, there's a lot of work to be done." As these changes unfolded, it became clear that the incident that began with an act of prejudice was transforming into a catalyst for a much larger social revolution. James Carter's community dialogues expanded, bringing together officers and residents who had never before had the opportunity to speak openly with each other. Michael Reed's investigative series on police reform won a prestigious journalism award, further amplifying the conversation on a national level. Wilson, with the support of Chief Thompson, began implementing his community outreach program for new recruits, taking them into neighborhoods they once feared to build relationships and understanding. And Mrs. Thompson, despite the trauma she had endured, found herself at the forefront of a movement she had studied her entire academic career. She was no longer just theorizing about change, she was actively creating it. As the city grappled with these sweeping changes, other communities began to take notice. Requests for Mrs. Thompson and Chief Thompson to speak and share their reform model started pouring in from across the country. The incident that began with a single act of prejudice had sparked a nationwide conversation on race, policing, and the possibility of genuine institutional change. 6 months had passed since the initial incident, and transformations were visible in both institutions and individuals' lives. Mrs. Thompson, now nationally recognized as a leader in the fight against institutional racism, faced new challenges. Her racial re-education program was being implemented in police departments across several states. but she knew that real change required more than just training. At a national conference on public safety, Mrs. Thompson surprised everyone by inviting Parker to speak alongside her. Real transformation, she said, isn't just about punishing mistakes, but showing that change is possible. Parker, visibly nervous, took the stage. His transformation was evident, not just in his words, but in his posture and gaze. "I was the problem," he began, his voice trembling. "But now, I want to be part of the solution. Every day is a struggle against old habits and deep-rooted prejudices, but it's a fight worth having." His emotional speech about his journey of self-discovery and change left the audience in reflective silence. For many, seeing a former aggressor now actively advocating for change was a powerful testimony to the possibility of transformation. Chief Thompson, facing constant resistance, implemented significant structural changes in the police department. He established a new performance evaluation system that included metrics for community engagement and peaceful conflict resolution. Initially viewed with skepticism, the system began to show promising results, with a notable reduction in incidents of police violence. Wilson, the young officer who had reported the abuses, became a mentor for new recruits. He developed a conscious policing program that emphasized empathy, non-violent communication, and cultural understanding. "Our job isn't just to enforce the law," he told his students, "but to serve and protect all members of the community, regardless of their color or background." Emily Brooks expanded her work beyond reporting. She began collaborating with the police department on a pioneering community mediation project, where officers and community members worked together to resolve conflicts peacefully. In one of these mediation sessions, a powerful moment occurred when a young black man confronted an officer about a traumatic encounter he had experienced. The officer, trained in the new program, didn't defend himself, but listened attentively. "I'm sorry for what you went through," said the officer, with genuine empathy, "and I'm here to learn how to do better." Sarah Parker found a new purpose. She began leading support groups for police families, helping them navigate the emotional and ethical complexities of their work. "We can't ignore the impact that police work has at home," she explained. "Change needs to happen not just on the streets, but also in our living rooms." Michael Reed continued his investigative work, but now with a new focus: stories of transformation and success within the police. His series New Paths in Policing won a journalism award and helped change public perception about the ongoing reforms. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson faced her own personal challenge. Despite all the progress, she still struggled with the trauma of the attack. In a therapy session, she finally admitted, "Sometimes when I see a police car, I still feel fear. But then I remember all the work we're doing, and that fear transforms into hope." The racial re-education program expanded beyond the police, reaching schools, businesses, and other public institutions. In a high school in the city, a pilot project of Racial Awareness Week produced surprising results, with students reporting a significant shift in their perspectives on race and identity. Parker, continuing his journey of redemption, began working with at-risk youth in underprivileged communities, using his own story as a cautionary tale and a message of hope. "If I could change," he told them, "anyone can. The important thing is to recognize our mistakes and actively work to be better." Wilson's community outreach program began showing tangible results. Crime rates in participating neighborhoods dropped, while community satisfaction with police interactions improved dramatically. Chief Thompson, reflecting on the progress made, shared with his command staff, "We're not just changing policies, we're changing hearts and minds. It's slow, it's hard, but it's working. The city became a model for police reform, with delegations from other departments across the country coming to learn from their experience. James Carter, the community activist, found himself working closely with the police department he once protested against. "It's not perfect," he admitted, "but it's progress I never thought I'd see in my lifetime." As challenges persisted and the road to complete change was still long, it was undeniable that a profound transformation was underway. The incident that began with an act of prejudice had become the catalyst for a revolution in consciousness and action. Mrs. Thompson, reflecting on everything that had happened, shared with Chief Thompson, "We still have a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, I feel we're truly moving forward." 1 year after the initial incident, the city was preparing for an unprecedented event, the first National Forum on Police Reform and Racial Equality. The event, jointly organized by Mrs. Thompson, Chief Thompson, and a diverse committee of community leaders and public safety experts, promised to be a landmark in the country's history. In the days leading up to the forum, tension in the city was palpable. Human rights groups saw the event as a crucial opportunity to solidify the changes achieved, while more conservative sectors viewed it with distrust and resistance. Mrs. Thompson, now a national figure in the fight against institutional racism, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She knew that the success of the forum could catalyze changes across the country, but she was also aware of the risks. "We're about to challenge decades of entrenched practices," she confided to Chief Thompson. "We need to be prepared for resistance." Chief Thompson, in turn, faced his own challenge. A group of high-ranking officers, unhappy with the reforms, threatened to boycott the event. In a tense, closed-door meeting, Thompson confronted them. "Gentlemen, our choice is simple. Evolve or be left behind. This forum isn't a threat to our institution, it's our chance to strengthen it." Meanwhile, Parker, now actively working on implementing the racial re-education program, was invited to be one of the main speakers at the forum. News of his participation generated immediate controversy. Many questioned whether a former aggressor should have such a prominent platform. Wilson, now leading the community policing program, defended the decision. "Parker's journey is a powerful testimony that change is possible. His voice is crucial at this moment." Journalist Michael Reed, preparing special coverage of the event, uncovered disturbing information. Extremist groups were planning violent protests to disrupt the forum. He immediately alerted the authorities and the organizing team. Emily Brooks worked in conjunction with the event's security team to ensure that legitimate protests would be allowed while preparing for possible violent actions. "We have to show that we can handle dissent in a peaceful and constructive manner," she insisted at a planning meeting. On the eve of the forum, Mrs. Thompson received an anonymous threatening call. Despite her family's pleas to cancel her participation, she remained firm. "If we back down now, everything we've fought for will have been in vain." Chief Thompson reinforced security around Mrs. Thompson and the other main participants, but concern was evident on his face. Parker, preparing for his speech, faced his own demons. The prospect of speaking publicly about his past and transformation left him anxious. In a moment of doubt, he called Sarah. "What if I'm not the right person to do this?" he questioned. Sarah, who had become a strong ally in the fight for change, encouraged him. "Your story is powerful precisely because it's not perfect, it's real." On the morning of the forum, the streets around the convention center were packed. Protesters from both sides gathered, some with signs of support, others with messages of protest. The police, trained in new de-escalation tactics, maintained a vigilant but non-confrontational presence. Inside the convention center, the atmosphere was one of nervous anticipation. Community leaders, police officers, politicians, and activists gathered, many meeting face-to-face for the first time outside of conflict situations. Wilson, observing the diverse crowd, felt a mix of pride and apprehension. This is what we've been working for, he thought, but it could all fall apart if we're not careful. As Mrs. Thompson took the stage to open the event, silence fell over the audience. She looked at the diverse crowd, took a deep breath and began. Today, we're not just discussing policies or procedures. We're here to reimagine the very fabric of our society. The National Forum on Police Reform and Racial Equality was about to begin, and with it, the climax of a journey of transformation that had started with a single act of injustice a year ago. The first day of the National Forum on Police Reform and Racial Equality was drawing to a close when the unexpected happened. Parker, the former officer whose assault on Mrs. Thompson had sparked the entire movement, was about to give his speech. As he approached the podium, a commotion erupted at the back of the auditorium. A group of protesters opposed to the reforms had managed to enter, shouting accusations of betrayal and weakening the police. Chief Thompson and his security team immediately sprang into action, but the situation quickly spiraled out of control. In the midst of the confusion, an armed protester advanced towards the stage. It was at this moment that Parker, without hesitation, placed himself between the aggressor and Mrs. Thompson. "Enough violence!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the still open microphone. Silence fell over the crowd. The protester, surprised by Parker's action, stopped in his tracks. Seizing the moment, Parker began to speak, his voice trembling at first but gaining strength. "I was like you," he said, looking directly at the protester, full of anger, fear, and prejudice. "I thought I was protecting something, but I was actually destroying. Look at me now. Look at all of us here. We're trying to build something better, not just for some, but for everyone." Mrs. Thompson, overcoming her initial shock, joined Parker on the stage. She placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that no one could have predicted a year ago. "This is the moment of choice for all of us," she declared, her voice firm and clear. "We can continue on the path of fear and division, or we can choose the courage to change, to unite." The armed protester, visibly shaken, lowered his weapon. Security guards detained him without violence, following the new de-escalation protocols. Wilson, who was in the audience, took the stage and grabbed the microphone. "I was a rookie when I witnessed the incident that brought us here. I was afraid to speak up, afraid to act. But I learned that true policing isn't about force or fear. It's about courage. The courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult." The tension in the air began to dissipate. Protesters from both sides, who moments before were ready for confrontation, now listened attentively. Emily Brooks seized the moment to propose an impromptu open dialogue session. "This forum shouldn't just be about us talking to you, but about all of us talking to each other. Who wants to share their story, their fears, their hopes?" What followed was a raw and emotional session of testimonies. Police officers shared their challenges and fears. Community members spoke about their experiences of discrimination and abuse. Tears were shed, apologies were offered, and more importantly, people who once saw each other as adversaries began to see each other as human beings with shared concerns. Michael Reed, who was live-streaming the event, realized he was witnessing a historic moment. His hands trembled as he narrated the events to millions of viewers across the country. As the night wore on, Chief Thompson took the stage for a surprise announcement. "What we've witnessed here today is bigger than any plan we could have made. I propose we transform the rest of this forum into a series of open dialogues like this. Let's build our solutions together, in real time." The proposal was met with thunderous applause. Mrs. Thompson, emotionally moved, made the closing remarks. "A year ago, I was the victim of an act of violence and prejudice. Today, I stand here not as a victim, but as an agent of change, and I'm not alone. Each of you here is an agent of change. What happened today proves that transformation is not just possible, it's happening now, through us." When the session finally ended, it was past midnight, but no one wanted to leave. Groups formed spontaneously throughout the hall. Police officers and civilians, conservatives and progressives, all engaged in deep and honest conversations. Parker, exhausted but invigorated, turned to Mrs. Thompson. "When you offered me a chance at redemption, I didn't believe it was possible. Now I see that true redemption isn't just personal, it's collective." Mrs. Thompson smiled, tears in her eyes. "This is just the beginning, Richard. Just the beginning." As the sun rose over the city, it was clear to all present that something profound had changed. The Forum was no longer just an event, but the birth of a new movement, a new way of approaching society's deepest challenges. 6 months after the dramatic National Forum on Police Reform and Racial Equality, the impacts of that historic event were visible across the country. Mrs. Thompson's racial re-education program had been adopted as official policy not just for the police, but for all public servants in several major cities. Chief Thompson, now promoted to commissioner, oversaw an unprecedented transformation in law enforcement agencies nationwide. Preliminary statistics showed a significant drop in cases of police violence, especially against minorities. More impressively, community trust in the police had increased, resulting in better cooperation and higher crime solve rates. Parker, whose journey of redemption had inspired many, now led a national police reform program, traveling the country to share his experience and implement changes. His story had become a powerful example of how acknowledging mistakes and a genuine commitment to change could transform lives and institutions. Wilson, the young officer who had reported the abuses, was promoted to a leadership position in the new Community Relations Department. His conscious policing program was being replicated in police academies across the country. Emily Brooks saw her community mediation work expand into a national program, with conflict resolution centers being established in traditionally marginalized communities. Journalist Michael Reed won a prestigious journalism award for his coverage of the Forum and his ongoing series on transformations in public safety. His work had helped change the national narrative on policing and race. But perhaps the most profound change had occurred in communities. Dialogue groups between police officers and residents, inspired by the spontaneous moment at the Forum, had spread across the country. These difficult but necessary conversations were slowly rebuilding trust between the police and the communities they served. Mrs. Thompson, reflecting on the journey of the past year and a half, wrote in her diary, "When I was attacked that day, I thought it was the end. But it became a beginning, a painful, difficult, but necessary beginning. I see now that real change doesn't just come from laws or policies, but from transformed hearts and minds. We still have a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, I feel true hope." The case that began with an act of prejudice had transformed into a catalyst for systemic change. It wasn't the end of the fight against racism and police violence, but it represented a significant turning point. As other cities and states began to adopt the pioneering reforms, it became clear that the country was embarking on a new era of policing and race relations. An era built not on fear and division, but on dialogue, understanding, and a shared commitment to justice for all. 5 years later, in a city square, a statue was unveiled. It depicted Mrs. Thompson and Parker hand in hand, symbolizing the country's journey of transformation. Around it, children of all colors played, while police officers chatted amicably with residents. Mrs. Thompson, now an internationally respected advisor on police reforms, smiled at the scene. She knew the work would never be completely finished, but the progress was undeniable. The incident that had almost taken her life had transformed into the seed of profound and lasting change. Dear viewers, if this story has touched your heart and made you reflect on the changes we still need in our society, don't stay idle. Share this video, initiate difficult but necessary conversations in your community. Remember, change begins with each of us. If you've watched this far, comment "I watched until the end" to show your support. And don't forget to click on the end screen video that will appear soon. There, you'll find more content addressing important topics like this one. Together, we can make a difference. Until the next video.